The Future, Taking Over Your School. Just as most books often have a chapter devoted to sharing their success stories, the authors usually close by offering their projection of what the future may look like if their ideas take off. Speculating about the future is fun, but also quite impossible. I have no way of knowing whether this book will be successful at all. Right now, its impact exists only in a quantum probability cloud. Reference 310. But let's have some fun and speculate. What if this book is a success? What if thousands of teens, or tens of thousands of teens, or, dare I say, millions of teens listen to this book and begin creating their own self-directed learning centers in their communities? What would that world look like? What are the consequences of such a world? With so many youth shifting their time toward freely available, community-based resources, it's possible that many of them will outgrow the library or whatever space they've set up their headquarters in. If they're able to grow a vibrant learning community, I imagine they'd be able to think creatively to find other spaces to adapt to the growth of their community. One possibility is the growth of unique housing environments near the libraries, where young people live and work together. When people ask what I would have done differently if I could redo my college education, I share that I would have just rented a big house with a bunch of other like-minded college-age students and worked on our own projects instead of spending so much money on tuition and room and board. I've stayed in so-called hacker hostels in Silicon Valley, which take a similar approach to providing living and working space under one roof. Co-living spaces that blend workspaces and living space like these are popping up in more places where digital nomads are living, like the one I stayed at in Costa Rica last winter. I've also stayed at a couple intentional communities in Asheville, North Carolina, and San Diego, California, as well as a co-housing community in Northampton, Massachusetts. They all had different approaches to organizing, making decisions, how space was used, and what type of people they attracted, but they all functioned fairly well. That's not to say that there would be younger teens living in these communities, but these communities could be places that house older teens and accommodate younger folks being there during the day working on projects. It would look differently in different communities, but I did hear of a couple of adult unschoolers in the Pacific Northwest purchasing a house and renting rooms to older teen unschoolers, so this isn't too unrealistic. If this movement does grow substantially, which I think it will, the library is going to run out of space for all these teens. Human nature seems to say that if a group is growing and running out of resources and needs to expand, they may consume the resources of their natural competitor. So maybe teens can take over their local public school. I imagine there is a tipping point in any community, after which there are so many teens pursuing self-directed learning at the library and so few teens continuing to attend regular school that a drastic change takes place. Either the administration will be forced to accommodate their dwindling numbers by evolving their policies toward a more self-directed approach, or the students will revolt and take over the school. While the idea of teens taking over their school seems like a reason to celebrate, there is one realistic downside. What happens if not all the students in the school are in favor of self-directed learning? For example, imagine a scenario where a school has 1,000 teens, and 600 of them protest and demand the school be run by teens. Now imagine that they succeed and their school transforms into being student-run. What about those 400 students who did not choose to participate in the protest? What happens to them? For a long time, I resisted suggesting that youth should overthrow their school administration because I've been concerned about this subset of students. I felt bad that a teen could wake up one day to find their school suddenly tipped upside down, and they could be forced to adapt to a new structure they didn't sign up for. Having self-directed learning forced on someone doesn't feel very self-directed. At the same time that I hold discomfort with that idea, I also don't think that we should hold on to old, obsolete ideas simply because it would disturb the status quo to transition to a new idea. I've come to accept now that this transition would be a good thing and wouldn't leave those hesitant students in a wake of destruction. After all, in a system where teens are running the school, it is still possible to have teachers and classes which accommodate those teens that are less interested in self-direction. The whole idea here is that they get to choose. They could opt in to being told what to do. I think this fear I hold is misplaced, but only time will tell. In speculating about the future, we must accept that there are countless possibilities and we'll never know until the future arrives. Maybe, instead of students taking over their school, school would just evolve to become an extension of the library. Peter Gray's research says that the government currently spends about 60 times as much money on schools than they do on libraries, reference 311. Imagine if that money were spread out more evenly, or even reversed. Imagine a world where a space with the library's self-directed philosophy had a school's budget, space, resources, and teachers. Or maybe instead of teens using this audiobook to guide the creation of zero-tuition, student-initiated learning centers, they will be inspired to rally and take over their schools immediately. I imagine this could happen in a few locations, and those takeovers could inspire more takeovers across the country. I've been finding it ironic that youth have been so active in organizing around gun control and climate change, yet we still haven't seen protests related to students' rights. My guess is that it's because many parents and adults, and the media, support gun control and climate change marches, but would not all be on board for protests related to overthrowing the authoritarian educational structure itself. We've already seen students be punished just for walking out of the school briefly during gun control and climate protests, reference 312. Imagine what would happen if the students were to actually strike and refuse to return to class until their demands were met. I have thought about focusing my efforts on these sorts of actions and decided this book was a better approach. Maybe it is a cop-out. Protests are a way to demand those in power make changes. My approach, instead, is to take that power away from authority figures by creating something where those in power cannot dictate the rules to you. I prefer an approach that doesn't require asking those in power for permission. That's not to say my approach is correct, and I'd certainly support any youth organizing a protest in favor of self-directed learning. I just feel that creating your own learning centers is a more strategic approach, and one which also doesn't require you to convince the majority of your peers that self-directed learning is for them. You can simply choose self-directed learning for yourself and go after it. I definitely encourage you to link up with others on the Peer Unschooling Network to get involved in activism. The National Youth Rights Association may be a good organization to reach out to as well, though their focus seems to be more about reforming school policy rather than abolishing compulsory education, reference 313. I see some hope in the youth activism happening at One Stone, where they recently ran their first Hands Down, Voices Up Summit to empower youth, reference 314. Another group, going by the name Academia Revolution, also appears to be sprouting some activism efforts. They are planning an online campaign to promote self-directed learning among young people, and even to open their own learning center based on the ideas outlined in their Academia Manifesto, reference 315. I also see possible activism growing out of the school survival community, which was started in 1999 by an 11th grader who goes by the name Soul Riser, reference 316. I do hope at some point these different youth activism groups join forces to create a larger movement that is as strong as the climate change and gun control movements that have been so prevalent in the news. One piece of information I'd like to include here for the aspiring activists is a chart I first saw in the book Organizing for Social Change, reference 317. This graphic displays an axis along which the different kinds of community organizing are listed. As you move down the axis, from direct service to self-help, to education, to advocacy, and finally to direct action, you move away from organizing that accepts existing power relationships and toward organizing that challenges existing power relationships. The main message from this graphic is to look at what kind of activism will help you get to the root of the problem, which is often caused by power imbalances. As human rights activist David Oakes described to me, imagine seeing a flow of drowning babies coming down a river. Your instinct is to jump in and save them. But you quickly get tired and overwhelmed because you can't save them all. So you may start a program and get others to join you to help rescue the babies. Maybe even a training to teach the babies to swim so you don't have to manually rescue them all. This helps, but ultimately, you really need to go up the river and find out who's throwing these fucking babies in the water and stop them. Reference 318. This book is focused on creating a self-help program and education, and the Peer Unschooling Network can be thought of as a direct service. This allows you to escape the school system and thrive without ever changing the school system. If you want change to happen, it's going to arise from advocacy and especially from direct action. Direct action involves the use of strikes, demonstrations, civil disobedience, marches, and other public forms of protest to demand those in power make changes. Of course, the youth rights resistance won't occur without a fight from those in power. In a more pessimistic projection of the future, maybe the government will respond to the popularization of self-directed learning, and laws will be passed outlawing homeschooling or unschooling. It's really impossible to predict the future, but one thing is certain: change always happens. Rather than fearing change, my greater fear is that conditions will continue as they are today or get worse. Just this week, I read a new article in The Guardian titled, "Under Digital Surveillance: How American Schools Spy on Millions of Kids," which detailed the efforts schools are making to monitor and control teens' behavior. Reference 319. I remember when I was working on Open Source High that I got to meet some of the individuals involved in these security companies disguised as education technology companies, and it's disheartening to see their products now on the market. It seems like the focus of investment in innovation in education is becoming more and more about controlling students than it is on actual learning. Not to worry, things change, and you can be the one who changes things. I'm reminded of a quote by a hero of mine named Aaron Swartz, who was a computer programmer, entrepreneur, and internet activist. Aaron was a great example of a young person in modern times who fought for what he believed in, one of the few examples of modern leadership that I truly respect. Tragically, Aaron is also an example of a citizen standing up to our authoritarian system and paying the price with his life. Aaron spoke in a documentary about his feelings of things being static and unchangeable. Growing up, I slowly had this process of realizing that all the things around me that people had told me were just the natural way things were, the way things always would be, they weren't natural at all. They were things that could be changed, and they were things that, more importantly, were wrong and should change. And once I realized that, there was really no going back. Reference 320. I relate a lot to Aaron's words, since he was in his early 20s when he said this, which is around the time I started becoming more interested in social change. Activists often talk about real change needing to come from the bottom up. Many people feel like this is already happening with the unschooling movement, liberated learner centers, agile learning centers, and Sudbury schools. This is because these organizations are formed by individuals rather than large bureaucratic institutions. My opinion is that these movements are not quite bottom up because they are not being created by the teens themselves. They still end up with an adult who is in charge, either the parent or the manager-owner of the learning center. In my view, a true bottom-up system will be completely student-driven. It is for this reason that I am trying to stand back and help facilitate the formation of student-initiated learning centers rather than put myself in charge. Although I run the Peer Unschooling Network, I also try to serve the youth there as much as possible and solicit and implement their ideas. Ideally, youth would take over operation of the website altogether. Even in writing this book, I am informing you of my perspectives on self-directed learning, but not forcing anything on you. It's up to you to do all the work. I even invite you to devise a better approach than I have laid out in this book. If you do, please share it with the other teens on the Peer Unschooling Network so they can use your ideas.